All right, hello. Welcome to another episode of Financial Clarity Live. I'm Josh Notes, your host, and I'm here today with my partner, Phil Maffey, CFO at Sustain CFO, and our esteemed financial analyst, Augie Manzella. Thank you guys for joining me. Today, we're going to be discussing the CFO's role in setting revenue targets. And since we happen to have a CFO with us, we're going to be focusing our attention there and getting into a considerable amount of details. So when you think about revenue targets, obviously there is a little bit of art and science involved, and you run the risk of either setting them too high, potentially overextending your resources, or too low and you leave money on the table. So today we're going to talk with Phil, our CFO, and Augie's going to back him up as the financial analyst on how do we approach this process and really find a balanced approach. So let's jump right in. All right. So Phil, can you give us your take specifically on why revenue forecasting matters and why it kind of drives the whole ship forward?
Yeah, I think, simplistically at the end of the day, if you're not generating revenue and, earning a profit, you're not going to be in business for very long. So, while this is the most difficult to get right, I think you get the most fruitful reward out of going through the exercise of, identifying where the opportunities to go after are, who's going after them, and what that means for the whole P&L. Everything flows downhill from here.
Okay, great. And Augie, as you've seen, getting into the details, maybe going kind of from back to front here, how have you seen a data-driven approach on behalf of the clients lead to a better outcome, tighter forecasting, and ultimately better decision-making?
Well, it's a lot like that saying where, if you're going to try to steer a large ocean liner versus a little speedboat, you're not going to make as much of a turn at once. It's a gradual thing, but before you know it, you've gone a far distance from your original trajectory. So that works, that cuts two ways. That's in a good way. Once you have all your numbers in front of you in an organized way, you can see where your estimates were off and whether that's, a plus or minus, and it gives you a lot tighter control. Whereas if you're not doing that and everything is on the bubble or an estimate of some sort, you might be making assumptions that are hurting the business more than helping it and not even knowing it.
Yeah, and when you're talking about those assumptions, we're going to get into the details of this, but we're talking about hiring, firing, we're talking about investments in R&D and other components of the actual core model. We're talking about cash flow, and we're talking about the value of the business enterprise, whether you're heading towards an exit or you're looking to refinance or you're looking to acquire some capital or some investors along the way to grow. So all these are critical. And I like this. The CFOs are not just number crunchers; they are strategic revenue architects. Maybe we're getting degrees here that we didn't earn in school, but we'll take them as we can get them. So, looking at the key inputs of a revenue forecast process, I guess Phil, can you kind of just take us through these step by step? We'll get into the details, but make sure people at least understand that are listening where they would find these items and maybe, what they might look like if we are today, our topic and our client avatar is going to be that of a technology owner of a SaaS business making between 10 and $20 million of revenue. So I'll just put that out there.
Right. I mean, the kind of breaking this down, right? So you've got a bunch of, data that you're going to use to come up with these assumptions, right? You don't want to just do kind of one of these and guess at things. You're going to try to make a educated assumption to do what we call a more bottoms up drivers based approach to revenue forecasting as opposed to a tops down approach, right? So that's something along the lines of a bunch of executives sitting in the room and saying, next year we want to make 20 million instead of 15 million. And that's our growth target. And that's what we're going after, right? That's the top down approach. That's just kind of picking a number out of thin air because it sounds good and investors will like to see that level of revenue growth. And that's how you come up with your revenue forecast and target. And I've seen this approach and then it doesn't work for a plethora of reasons. But the number one reason being it's not grounded in any sense of reality. So how are we going to try to do that? right? So the first thing we're going to look at is what's going on around us, right? So that's where you see this market trends, industry growth rates. There's no shortage of really good information that you can use to benchmark yourself against folks in your industry, in your country. So, look at NYU Stern, for instance, has a bunch of free resources where you can, if you want to know what revenue targets in your industry should be, you can see what other folks are doing, in your space. So this could give you a good sense of, when you're done coming up with numbers, are you on pace to keep up with your competition? And what's capable and what's possible and where you're located in your business. The second one here, number two, the sales pipeline and historical data. I think the pipeline is really going to be your most accurate form of revenue input, because that's going to be based on what the sales team is telling you, right? So you can use different tools or just use a spreadsheet, right? There's the Salesforce.coms, there's HubSpot, and there's no shortage of tools that will allow you to track all of the possible opportunities. And to the extent you do a good job of this with the sales team, you're going to have some real-time information to inform your revenue forecasting, right? If six guys are sitting across the table saying, these are all the deals that we may close, that's going to give you a good sense of the range of possible outcomes. The next thing down here, churn and retention, right? So this is, in the SaaS type of business, you're going to get a sense of how quickly or how long your customers stay with you. And that's what your churn rate is telling you, right? How long are people paying for your service? And retention, similar type of metric where you're kind of saying how long, how many people are we keeping on our, and that's going to be, again, a form what the forward-looking revenue forecast looks like. Kind of we look at it split between, you got your new business and you've got your existing business from your current customers, right? How much can you expect from that current customer base? And that's going to get a lot of information about that from these types of metrics. Pricing and product changes, right? So that's, kind of the units times price per unit type of revenue forecasting. But, if you're in a type of business where you are, producing products, understanding, what those can possibly sell for in the marketplace. And then again, how much you can possibly produce is going to give you, again, a range of outcomes of, my projecting my revenue to be more than I could possibly produce and sell in a year, right? Those are kind of limiting variables that you want to make sure you stay within. And then the last one on the list here, a little bit more zoomed out, but macroeconomic conditions affect things in the business world in a real way when it comes to things like interest rates or tariffs or doing business across borders or whatever it may be, whether it's across states, country lines. So understanding what's going on in general will inform decisions about whether a new market to move into is a good idea, right? And then that's obviously a lot of folks look for growth. You have to expand outside of where you are and understand what's going on. And once you do that, expansion is super important. So maybe a little bit long-winded there, Josh, but a lot that goes into all of these different pieces. But a good bottoms-up forecast is going to be comprised of various components of all of these. With the best that we can do, with the right people enrolled in the process to come up with this bottoms-up target that's got a lot of, we'll get into, buy-in from the team and grounded in a sense of reality in the metrics that the team is tracking towards and understands, whether they move and the levers that will ultimately, drive what's going on with the top line.
All right. So we got the foundation in place there. Augie, want to just real quick, I think a lot of folks get stuck on step number 2 with the sales pipeline. How do you measure sales pipeline efficiency? I'm going to go to the next slide while you answer that one.
First and foremost, I would say you look at overall conversion rate. So how many leads are coming into your pipeline versus how many closed deals. Then I would say the size of the deals. And third, how long it takes to convert. So what is the amount of time that it takes to go from a proposal to a closed deal?
Right. And depending on the business model, those times can adjust greatly. And especially if we're talking about a high-end software, those can be pretty long sales cycles. So I think as we talk about the CFO and aligning with sales, it's hard if it's a startup, which is why we're not talking about a startup today. We're talking about a business that is an ongoing concern, has $10 to $20 million of revenue. And, I guess, Phil, as you look at these bullets that are on the screen and how you've guided these processes for our clients, what jumps out to you as being, the most important to focus on if you only have, a few minutes to zero in on this slide?
Yeah, I think what ties all of this together is a sense of accountability and ownership and realism that goes into these conversations that are ultimately having in the business that you describe, right? There's a bunch of sales, there's a sales teams, right? There's a bunch of executives involved in these conversations. To the extent that everyone has a level of ownership and accountability and believes in those assumptions, right? That is the most important thing. All right. If everyone understands what metrics they're looking at and buys in on the targets, they need to be realistic, but also growth oriented. Finding that balance can be tough, but that's the sales guy's job to go out there and drive revenue. And then, if everyone knows how to use the pipeline and how to look at it, and if the right people are reviewing it and using that to inform assumptions, right? All of this is, I guess, in my mind, linked together by the cross team visibility and accountability and ownership of all of the different pieces that make this come together.
Right. And obviously, folks are measured against these metrics that we're talking about. And we always want to be aligned in business with our word. However, predicting the future is not for the risk averse, because you will naturally not be 100% accurate. So when we talk about the over promising component of this, I think first thinking about investors and how you message to them, then thinking about internal targets, and then making sure that pressure does create diamonds, as we know, but it also can make folks kind of shrivel up and head for the door. So we're going to look at how that plays out here in the next couple slides. But I've got churn and retention here as something that folks forget about, right? It's the existing business that you already have, and the inability to not only upsell it but just maintain it can be kind of the road crumbling beneath your feet as you try to walk on it, towards a bigger, better destination. So we've got an example here of this, but I guess, Phil, how should businesses forecast revenue loss due to churn? Like, how do you suggest they go about that process?
So to the extent that a business has historical information that they can use to do this math, right? It's a math exercise at the end of the day. You can use those percentages, those ratios, and assume in the future, while you don't know which client it's going to be, you're going to see a similar level of churn, unless you do something operationally that's going to drive customer satisfaction and make that a lower number. So the first thing you need to do is start by measuring it, right? So, and we do this with our business. I think it's a very common practice when you are forecasting your revenue to separate it into two different buckets, right? You've got your existing clients. It's easier to keep the ones you've got than it is to go find new ones. And then you've got your targets for your new clients. And for your existing business, right, and this is where the churn and retention comes in, how many of those clients, how long are they staying for? So you can measure start with the day they start, and if they leave you, kind of measure how long that time frame is. And then you can do the math to say, if I'm making $10 million this year from my existing clients and next year I only made 9 million, right? I had a 10% attrition rate. What's driving that? For a plethora of reasons, but so when I'm building my targets for the next fiscal year, if I have an existing I get some new business and now I'm doing 12 million of existing business, I'm going to assume a similar 10% retention rate, right? So that 12 million in new business for existing clients by the end of the year is going to be 10% less. I'm going to try to, in a business world, I'm going to replace those with new clients. So my total client count may never go down. But by looking at this new versus existing client base and then doing these measurements of those existing clients and how long they stay with us and dollars contracts per client, things like that, you can come up with these retention numbers. And then that then informs the future where you say, I know I'm never going to keep 100% of my clients. Historically, I lose X% of my clients. You can, again, industry benchmark what a good ratio for the industry you're in. It's going to vary. And you kind of have armed with all of this information, you're not going into your revenue planning cycle saying to yourself, hey, I have $10 million of business this year from my existing clients. They all love me, and it's still going to be here by the end of next year, right? That's a pipe dream. Even if you can't point to any individual one you may lose, that it's a reality in business. So
Sure.
I think that's a little bit of a crash course on how you think about this and setting up your structure for your forecasting process to be able to track your business based on existing customer. From a historical perspective will be easy because you don't have any new customers, many results. But as you're talking about things go across into the future and targeting salespeople, it's important to be able to say what's new business versus what's existing business. And then you get into things like upsell and kind of saying, I got a client that's going to be more or less and things like that. But that's the core nature of how we approach this.
if we're going into the details of that, and Augie, I'll ask you to kind of keep it pointed, but how do you identify warning signs for increased churn that might be, right in front of the eyes of the owner, but maybe they weren't looking that deep into the details?
So obviously this is going to be.
I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. So obviously this is going to be specific to the industry that you're in, but to give a few examples, declining customer engagement, an increase in issues being reported via support tickets, lower renewal rates. Those are all kinds of things that are pointing, and maybe you're going to see a spike in churn.
Okay, got it. We got a couple things to keep an eye on. So now let's talk about the role of pricing and product expansion. Obviously, this depends on industry and depends on your product offering. But again, Phil, give us the lowdown. How do you view this? How does the CFO weigh in on this topic in the boardroom or in the office or in the discussion around revenue forecasting?
So I've seen, in my past lives where there's, full teams dedicated to pricing and what that should look like. And it's just a different, a key component of the equation, right? So we're talking about churn in the last slide and our customer counts, right? How much we're charging those customers is the other side of that equation. Where if I have 10 clients and I'm charging each of them $10,000, right? I know what my revenue is going to be. But, am I going to keep charging those same 10 clients that same $10,000 3-4 years from now? Probably not, right? So, the pricing is going to be subject to external market factors, right? You can't just raise your prices ad nauseum without seeing some repercussions from your clients. So, that's going to be a key thing to key in on. The CFO is going to be the one raising this macro concern, and then pointing to folks on the sales lines. What can the customers tolerate from price increases or decreases, which whatever direction they're going. Can we decrease and get a larger market share or something like that? So, the pricing and how that ultimately affects buyer behavior is going to be a key component of forecasting our revenue. Right, if I'm selling a widget, how much I can sell that widget for is going to ultimately dictate what my revenue forecast is.
Yeah, and I think you said this to me before, right? The biggest mistake that folks make a lot of times is the CEO relies on gut feeling over data. So if they're just picking their numbers without modeling or doing any testing on that pricing, they're gambling. They're not forecasting, and that is best to be done in a casino, not in your business. Augie, as you think about this, how do you, as the analyst, refine these revenue forecasts over time?
Well, it's important to recognize what's actually driving renewals and engagement. And it happens to be that if a person or if a customer buys 2 or more products, they tend to renew at a 30% higher rate. So once you see certain things like that, you want to be focusing where your efforts are going to be rewarded, and locating those key factors and driving them towards increased retention.
All right, so we're going to put this kind of all together now and talk about a very specific situation. So, we talked about step 1, analyzing the historical trends, seasonality, patterns. Step 2, integrating the pipeline data. Step 3, factoring in churn, pricing changes, and economic conditions. And then step 4 would be that stress test that we just talked about regarding projections, best case, worst case, and likely scenarios. So we've got a real world example here with some, kind of KPI level dashboard up on the screen. It's a software company, 20 million in forecast, just like we talked about. Got some growth, roughly 20% of the next year, and they got some pipeline and some churn and everything else we'd expect. So it might be a little hard to read this for the audience, but Phil, as we go through this example, and let's just kind of make this as real as possible. You, the CFO in the room, I'm stepping up to say, okay, I'm the owner of this business in the land that we live in today on Financial Clarity Live. And Augie, you're the analyst. Can you bring us through this? It's going to be a workshop, 5 minutes here, but how do we actually do this?
So, I mean, hammer this home, day in and day out, right? This is just a process, right? It's not like it's something you do once and then you put it on the shelf and you look at it and you never revisit it again. The value in what we're doing here is that you're looking at this stuff month in and month out. So when it comes time to, in this particular example, you're looking at an annual target setting exercise, right? So this is inherently going to be a little bit of a higher level view of the world, oftentimes happening, maybe a couple, if you're doing it right, maybe a couple months ago when you're kind of really finalizing things coming into the beginning of January, sitting here in February, we should have a really good view of what we think 2025 is going to look like at this high level view of the world. But the way these conversations awfully work in the beginning is that you, the owner of the business, is going to say, hey, we did $10 million this year. We did $15 million this year. We need to grow this business. I invested, we made 10 million last year. We poured a bunch of money back in to grow things. We invested in new products. We got new salespeople. For all of these reasons, I am expecting this business to grow. And then you're going to go back to your first in commands and on the operations side of the house and on the sales side of the house and assign them with, can we get to these targets, right? And it's going to be a high level conversation at a macro level to say, hey, I brought you in here, not to keep the existing revenue, but to go get new revenue. How are you going to do that, right? And the way this works is that, this target is aligned on by all the people responsible for going to get it. So what does that look like? A lot of times, if you have a sales team, they all have a sales target, which ultimately adds up to a higher number than what you're ultimately going to kind of project from a financial perspective, right? And then that sales more target is managed against, right? And Salesforce and looking at deals and things like that. So the way this conversation really works is, for all the reasons you see on this page, this is how we're going to get from point A to point B, this 40% revenue growth. And these are the things that are going to drive us. I'm not going to go into each and any of them individually, but the key takeaway here is that's, there's a team that should be responsible for getting new customers, right? Your internal operations and sales ops is responsible for keeping your current customers happy. And everyone's got targets around these different pieces of the business, right? Someone's managing the upsell of your consistent clients to go get that $3 million. So, this is going to be supported by a lot of data to say, these are the clients. This is our client base, right? This upsell can only come from our existing client base. Which ones are the most likely? Is this possible given our, everything that people who manage these things are seeing day in and day out? So by publishing this and, putting it on a piece of paper, as we say, then you send it around, to the team, and you never want to be in a situation where you walk into a meeting and the guy on the sales side of the house says, I don't know where these numbers came from, right? So if everyone's aligned towards what these targets are and what's driving them, then it's a conversation around, are we going to put our necks on the line, mark these as what we're going to do for the year, and then the next phase of that is month in and month out, we're going to track our progress against this and then adjust accordingly to say, so and so salesperson left, got to go get new ones, so and so's overachieving, underachieving, and that's where the work comes in month out to kind of take these higher level targets and goals and looking at this annual revenue target and then tracking towards that and adjusting the ship as using the boat analogy earlier. The bigger the ship, the harder it is to turn it on a dime. So we need to be making sure we pay close attention to all of the metrics, right? Which ones are trending in the wrong direction, and then putting this plan at risk, right? And things like that. So,
and you mentioned
go for a long time on this.
Trying to turn a ship overnight, or in this case, immediately, is going to be pretty difficult. But if you are meeting every 2 weeks, every month, every week, maybe you got somewhere between 12 and 24 turns or incremental movements to be able to be made, depending on how the business is actually operating. Augie, you've been in the room for so many of these discussions with our clients, some in a very similar size and scale of this growth stage SaaS tech company. What do you see to be the mistakes, or maybe even just like the difficult conversations that folks allow to slide by, especially if there is not a CFO in the room, or there's not an analyst to kind of stand up and make the stand? What do you see sliding by?
So the biggest thing I would say is basically there was something that Phil mentioned earlier. It's escaping my mind right now. But can you run that by me one more time?
I'll tell you what, I'm going to jump in with my answer, which is the slipping of the sales forecast, which I see like over and over and over where, hey, January's forecast didn't quite hit. Well, let's just keep February as is, and actually we'll tack on January's missed growth to that. So when that happens, if that was the answer I was seeking, what do you do about it? And how do you build that back into a forecast that still has accountability and trust, but at the same time doesn't allow, hopium, as we call it, to build up and up and up over the course of a year?
So one of the things that I've seen that's huge is before we step in, a lot of times close dates will be very amorphous and abstract. There's the numbers aren't getting done on a regular basis. It's kind of when it's an emergency, people will dedicate a few more hours and catch up. But once we step in and implement this as a process, it kind of forces people to be accountable and hit deadlines more accurately. And that creates all the structure that you need to be able to make active choices and good decisions based on what the information is telling you.
Sure. So trust the process. And then I think it's a lot of it comes from, not a bottoms up, but a top down leadership style, right? Is the leader one who is going to, be cruel when folks miss the forecast, or are they going to get to the why and then fix that root issue? That's a decision that folks, usually have made before they got into business, but it tends to flow with their personality. So, look, this is the process, Phil. And, to your point, it's not something to do once a year. It's something to do every month and keep in motion as we look to kind of sum this up and find this growth. We're early in this year as this is being aired in February. If you think about those final strategic moves that we might recommend, here's a laundry list of them. If you had to kind of zero in on one or two that you think most folks maybe are overlooking or not fully considering at this time of the calendar year, what would those be, and how would you encourage them to hold themselves accountable if they don't have a CFO in the room?
Yeah, it's easy for this. The finance function isn't the one necessarily out there responsible for driving the sales, so that inherently causes a lot of friction, just because it can be very easy to be objective and data driven, right? And we're just kind of saying, hey, this is what we said a month ago. You didn't hit it, and you kind of do what you want to avoid, I guess, in these conversations is getting combative and the sales guys and the finance guys arguing. I've seen it more than once to kind of it gets to be just different personality types in the room. I think you're balancing that, right? And I think to allude to what you were saying just now is, if you're the type of owner who just lets things miss your targets and you don't do something about it, you're not going to own your business for very long, right? You're going to have to use something objective, and we hear this from our clients all the time. Just this week, where it's like, I didn't have anything I could point to say, hey, this is what my expectation was, we didn't hit it, tell me why, right? And he was getting a lot of lip service, but as soon as he had a concrete number on a piece of paper, he is then able to go back to his team and hold them accountable. So if you can't, if you're a salesperson who's not making sales, you don't exist for very long as a salesperson in an organization, just by the nature of, nor should you, right? I mean, not that everyone deserves a job, but at the same time, if you're not performing, you need, the owner of business needs to know that and needs to find somebody who can, because if the expectation is to grow, you need good salespeople to be able to do that. So, I think kind of harping on the takeaway here and kind of alluding to what Augie said is, if you're sitting in the room and you're forcing these conversations to happen, and there's a benchmark on a piece of paper that you're holding people accountable to, that goes a long way in giving you, as the owner of the business, the objective, to kind of say, hey man, we talked about this last month. This is my objective. Tell me why you didn't hit it. And if I don't like the answer, then I need to go do something about that and get the answer I want to hear.
There we go. So being data driven, having that accountability and stepping in when that happens, and then following and trusting the process with, some human, but also some executive coming to the table. Well, look, this is the CFO's playbook on how to set smarter revenue targets. We've gone over all of it: aligning with sales, monitoring churn expansion, leveraging the pricing, stress testing the forecast, and focusing on data over the gut feeling. I I want to thank you, Phil, first and foremost, for leading us in this. And I want to thank both of you, Phil and Augie, for joining me as well as the guest on LinkedIn. Just a reminder to join our newsletter, Finance in 5, for weekly finance tips, updates, and Q&A from this episode. And we look forward to seeing everyone next week at 3 p.m. for our next episode, where we're going to help you gain financial clarity live. Thank you. Take care.